The transition into 1980 brought forth a season of sweeping global change as political landscapes around the world adapted to new social climates. New faces in places of power promised a break from the past in step for the future. In the Middle East, war raged in Afghanistan as the Soviet Union sought to subdue its southern neighbor to instill a complicit communist government. In Iran, 52 Americans were still being held hostage after Iranian protesters seized the American embassy in November of 1979.
For a government actually to support and in effect participate in the taking and the holding of hostages is unprecedented in human history. This violates not only the most fundamental precepts of international law, but the common ethical and religious heritage of humanity.
In April of 1980, President Jimmy Carter authorized a daring commando rescue mission. Due to technical problems, the operation was aborted, yet 8 American commandos perished when 2 mission-related helicopters collided with a transport plane. The hostages would have to wait. Months later, Iran found itself at war with its western neighbor, Iraq. Backed by American weaponry, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein sought to seize the oil-rich Iranian-held province of Khuzestan. May 19, 1980, Mount St. Helens in Washington State, a volcano dormant since 1855, violently erupts. The resulting cloud of ash, spewing 60,000 feet into the air and drifting over 500 miles in all directions, brings many towns to their knees. Once again, nature proves its power.
If the Soviet Union does not withdraw its troops from Afghanistan by the 20th of this month, then neither I nor the American people nor the Congress will support the sending of an Olympics team to Moscow this summer.
In July of 1980, the games of the 22nd Olympiad were opened in Moscow. In protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the United States, West Germany, Japan, and several other countries boycotted the games, and only 81 nations sent their athletes.
With gratitude and with determination, I accept your nomination.
In America, election time was near, and the race for the presidency headed down the stretch. Democrat incumbents Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale faced stiff competition from the Republican team, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, who assured voters that their agenda would relieve the record unemployment, staggering interest rates, and inflation that had crippled the national economy.
The League of Women Voters is pleased to welcome to the Cleveland, Ohio Convention Center Music Hall President Jimmy Carter and Governor Ronald Reagan of California, the Republican Party's candidate for the presidency.
Next Tuesday is Election Day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls. You'll stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
The polls on the weekend before the election were dead even. I'm not just talking about Carter's polls or the national polls. I'm talking about Ronald Reagan's polls. People, right up to the weekend before the election, weren't decided what they wanted to do. And then that Sunday before the election, the Ayatollah Khomeini pushed one more time against Jimmy Carter, and everyone said, that's it. That's it, Jimmy. Go on home to Georgia. We're going to elect Ronald Reagan. He won by a large majority. And he brought to the office his political ideology and philosophy, which he understood full well. And it was part of his political strength. You knew where Ronald Reagan stood. He told you what he wanted to do with the presidency before he came, and he made every effort to do it once he got there.
1980 also witnessed the birth of Solidarity in communist Poland. The movement was sprung when workers at the Lenin shipyard incited a nationwide strike demanding labor reform. To quell the strike and get Poland's economy back on track, the Soviet-backed government signed an unprecedented agreement with Solidarity's union head Lech Wałęsa, and new rights were granted to Polish workers. In the months to come, the union strikes escalated as Solidarity grew even stronger. The movement for change became a national cry that resonated pervasively throughout the country. The year ended on a sad note. On December 8th, former Beatle John Lennon was gunned down outside his New York City apartment by 25-year-old Mark David Chapman. The loss of the 40-year-old music icon was felt around the world.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I...
In America, 1981 brought forth a new era of government. On January 20th, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the nation's 40th president. Within minutes of Reagan's inauguration, the 52 American hostages being held in Iran were freed.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
By design or coincidence, after 444 long days in captivity, the hostages arrived on American soil and received a hero's welcome. Only 2 months after his inauguration, President Reagan was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt by 25-year-old John Hinckley. Reagan made a full recovery, yet his press secretary, James Brady, suffered severe head wounds that resulted in permanent brain damage. In May, the world witnessed... In April of 1981, the world watched in awe as the culmination of ingenuity and $10 billion launched a new era in space travel. The Columbia, a space shuttle, was seen as the first step in actually colonizing outer space.
The shuttle became seen as the way of getting more and more people into space, of having prolonged periods of time in space, and doing research on the human body, on science activities from various disciplines. We use it as a launch vehicle for communication satellites that would be popped out of the cargo bay. You could put science instruments in the cargo bay, study universal phenomena, and the space lab, which could fit in the cargo bay of a shuttle, was going to become this orbiting laboratory that instead of staying up there for long periods of time like a space station, you'd bring it back on at the conclusion of each shuttle mission.
The liftoff and landing of the massive ship was a triumph for NASA and the American space program. July of 1982 featured the wedding of the decade, when the heir to the British throne, Prince Charles of Wales, married a shy 20-year-old schoolteacher, Diana Spencer.
Charles Philip Arthur George.
Billions of people around the globe watched via live television as the young couple consummated their storybook romance.
The wedding of Prince Charles and Diana Spencer was an enormously important spectacle for Britain in the early years of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. An enormously important fairy tale, a fantasy of how life would be if they could catch a glimpse of the beautiful royal couple. It was also, of course, the first royal wedding in a very long time.
I do so swear.
September of 1981 was a groundbreaking month in American government as the Senate confirmed the appointment of a new Associate Justice to the highest court in the land. Sandra Day O'Connor was promoted from the Arizona Court of Appeals to become the first woman Supreme Court Justice in American history. That same year, England's Princess Diana gave the country the next in succession to the throne, Prince William.
I'm keeping him.
In America, moviegoers flocked to theaters to see Steven Spielberg's latest fare, E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
It's a love story between a young boy and a 600 to 800-year-old extraterrestrial.
The story of the friendly alien caught the imagination of the nation and the world, and soon became the largest grossing film to date.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
In March of 1983, President Reagan proposed a plan to protect America from nuclear missile attacks by building a new space-based defense system called Star Wars.
I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles.
Main engine start and ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut.
American history was made in June of 1983 when Sally K. Ride, a 32-year-old physicist, became the first American woman astronaut into space. Aboard the Challenger space shuttle, Ride's mission was successful and inspired a whole generation of young women to reach for their dreams beyond any gender bias that might be in the way. In October of 1983, President Reagan ordered the invasion of the tiny Caribbean nation of Grenada.
Grenada, we were told, was a friendly island paradise for tourism. Well, it wasn't. It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there.
1984 can perhaps be celebrated as the year of the yuppie, young urban professionals. This 25 to 34-year-old age group entered the job market in droves and controlled 23% of the nation's disposable income, an astounding statistic considering they had just begun their careers. They wanted only the best of what money could buy, designer clothes and exotic cars. Efficient imports had become the top-selling cars in America. U.S. automakers, slow to respond at first, were playing catch-up. Several models were rolled out to compete with the Japanese and German imports, but they lacked the charisma of the foreign models. And even though the price of gas was down due to a worldwide oil glut, Americans were wary of domestic cars. In the early years of the 80s, Ford and Chrysler both reported record losses. Meanwhile, the presidential elections drew closer. The leading contender for the Democratic nomination, Walter Mondale, broke new ground by choosing New York Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro to be his running mate. The 48-year-old Queens representative was the first woman to break the gender barrier in national politics.
By choosing a woman to run for our nation's second highest office, you send a powerful signal to all Americans. There are no doors we cannot unlock.
Yet when November came, Ronald Reagan won 49 states and 59% of the popular vote. The country was in no mood to alter its course. In the world of music, Michael Jackson thrilled the masses. His album Thriller exceeded everyone's wildest expectations, winning 8 Grammy Awards and topping the charts with 37 million in sales. At one point, Epic Records reported selling 1 million albums per week, breaking all industry records. Hit after hit, Michael Jackson captivated the world with his flashy wardrobe and awe-inspiring dance moves. "1984 saw the breakthrough of a new form of dance. Breakdancing, as it was called, pushed the envelope of human dexterity with amazing feats of acrobatics. On the heels of the new dance craze came the growing popularity of a new style of music called rap. The new sound soon became a permanent musical genre, and by the end of the decade, rap had become the most popular form of new music worldwide. Meanwhile, the world was enamored with the charms of singer-dancer extraordinaire Madonna, who had risen to superstar status with #1 hits like A Virgin and Crazy for You. Her seductive appeal would soon grace the silver screen as well, and by the end of the century, her record sales would top over 120 million, making her one of the most celebrated stars of the era. 1985 saw the passing of veteran actor Rock Hudson. Hudson had been one of Hollywood's top leading men since the late 50s and died from AIDS-related causes. The untimely death of the popular star brought a serious look into the severity of the disease.
The acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is a virus-associated disease. It was first described in 1981, both here in Los Angeles and in New York City. The disease is caused by a retrovirus, that is an RNA virus that infects T lymphocytes, which are one of the key immune cells in the body. As a result of that infection, the host immune system is impaired. So when the first cases were described, we saw these very unusual infections, and it took several years from those first few cases before we realized that this was due to HIV. human immunodeficiency virus. However, it wasn't until Rock Hudson and other people of his like developed these diseases and it was made public that the general population became aware that we were dealing with a very serious fatal illness.
Acquired immune deficiency syndrome had been considered to be a disease in the gay community and drug culture. It was now everyone's concern. The disease had infected people through blood transfusions and even from mother to baby during pregnancy. By 1985, 7,000 Americans had been diagnosed with AIDS, and the numbers were growing rapidly. By the end of the year, AIDS was reported in 51 countries around the world, and by the end of the decade, an estimated total of 1 million people would suffer from the dreaded disease.
It's estimated that about 15 million people will have died from AIDS and complications of AIDS by the year 2000, and that about 80% of these individuals will be from Central Africa.
As the relatively new blight of AIDS became increasingly prevalent in third world countries, the age-old ailments of poverty and hunger continued to plague the less fortunate. In the East African country of Ethiopia, famine had reached a staggering level as thousands of people perished daily of malnutrition. As graphic pictures of starving children reached the well-to-do nations of the world, multinational relief efforts intensified and a mass outpouring of money, food, and medicine was contributed. Even the music industry offered a helping hand. Following the successful recordings of USA for Africa and Band Aid, Irish singer and Band Aid originator Bob Geldof devised Live Aid. On July 13, 1985, satellite television linked Wembley Stadium in London to JFK Stadium in Philadelphia for a worldwide concert broadcast that featured the biggest names in music. Live Aid raised millions for the famine relief effort and reminded us that the power of music can change the world. 1986 arrived, and with it came a new holiday. On January 21st, the nation celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day in honor of the civil rights leader who dedicated his life to the cause of racial equality. Nearly 2 decades after his assassination, the holiday marked Dr. King's 57th birthday, becoming the first new holiday since 1948, when Memorial Day was created.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
January 28, 1986 was a day of great American tragedy. As millions of people watched, the Challenger space shuttle exploded 74 seconds after takeoff. Investigators later found that faulty O-rings on the fuel tanks caused the explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Among the tragic losses was Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire school teacher who was to have been the first civilian in space.
Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes. Dick, Mike, Judy, Elle, Ron, Greg, and Krista, your families and your country, mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
At the movies, Americans were lining up to see yet another Vietnam film, Platoon, from director Oliver Stone. Platoon garnered Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Picture.
Who's watching television?
Sitcoms continued to flourish. Leading the pack was The Cosby Show, with veteran comic Bill Cosby heading the fictional Huxtable family. Americans couldn't get enough of it. In the summer of '87, a congressional panel called Marine Colonel Oliver North to testify on his involvement in supplying the anti-Sandinista rebels of Nicaragua with arms. With limited immunity, North told of the complex web that sold illegal arms to Iran and funneled the profits into a fund that supported the Contras.
There was a newspaper in Lebanon, Beirut, that came out with a startling article that said the United States was selling arms to Iran, raising funds to help the Contras. And it was so astounding because the law says you can't do that. The Boland Amendment said you can't do that. It was prohibited. The Neutrality Act also said you can't do that. And so the Senate decided to look into it, and the House decided to look into it.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Although in the beginning, President Reagan denied any involvement or knowledge of this, in fact, a few days later, he had another press conference and said, yes, I was made aware of this, and thus began the Iran-Contra hearings.
I came here to tell you the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I am here to tell it all, pleasant and unpleasant. And I am here to accept responsibility for that which I did. I will not accept responsibility for that which I did not do.
Before proceeding, may I make an inquiry of the witness? Was that response from a written text?
As a result of the hearings and such, the federal grand jury met. They issued indictments. I believe there were about 20 or 30 counts. At the trial, they were found guilty. North and Poindexter and Secord, I believe it was, and Hakeem. But because we had provided certain limited immunity to North and Poindexter, their convictions were overturned. However, this investigation served a good purpose in indicating that if we're not vigilant, things like this can happen.
Of the 80s came to a crashing halt. After a continuous upward spiral since 1982, the stock market plummeted a record 508 points, doubling the market decline of 1929 that brought on the Depression. It sent shockwaves throughout the world financial community. The Tokyo market plunged sharply, and the Hong Kong exchange had to close for a week to stave off
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The close of 1987 marked another big step in the move towards peace. After his celebrated speech at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, President Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev in December to sign the historic INF agreement. In the U.S., 1988 was a presidential election year. In July, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis accepted the Democratic Party's nomination. Vice President George Bush easily became the Republican choice, and the race was on.
When you have to change horses in midstream, doesn't it make sense to switch to one who's going the same way?
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
When the votes were finally tallied, the nation was still in no mood to change directions. Bush was elected to office and became the first sitting vice president to do so since Martin Van Buren in 1836.
Congratulations.
In November, the world watched in awe as the Berlin Wall, one of the most notorious and imposing symbols of oppression in the world, was literally knocked down. The wall was originally constructed in 1961 to separate the city's communist sector from the Western Free Sector. 28 years later, the wall came tumbling down and the free world rejoiced.
Soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union died. Who killed it? Answer, the computer. When that machine was transistorized and miniaturized for the space program, people discovered it could make the production of everything much better, from autos to checkout counters to smart weapons that could be decisive in a future war. It soon became clear that a nation could no longer hope to be rich or strong unless its whole economy is computer-based. That created a problem for Russia. The computer demanded one decisive condition. To do its magic, its users had to have free access to full and accurate information. This the Soviets had never permitted. Their system was based on allowing their people limited information, with much of that falsified for reasons of state. But now, when Russia saw herself about to drop out of the great power class due to the computer, there was debate, agony, and finally a decision to risk all. Glasnost, openness, was adopted as official policy, and free access to information was allowed. Sure enough, as they feared, soon after, without that base of mind control to rest on, the whole vast structure of the Soviet state collapsed, ceased to exist, vanished like the Wicked Witch of the West. One whiff of truth and people would not stand for going back. After 74 years, the Soviet blip in world history was over.